Plein air refers to the act of painting outdoors. It's one thing to use images of nature as reference in our paintings and in our art, and it's another thing to go outside and actually sit with these landscapes and paint from real life. I'm a watercolor artist, so this video is specifically about my watercolor setup, although you can definitely apply a lot of these tips and tricks to oil painting and acrylic painting. First thing I want to discuss in this video are the materials that I use for painting outside. I created this custom watercolor palette. Outside especially, we don't want our paints to kind of go everywhere. We want them in a compact area where they're not going to scatter everywhere if there's a gust of wind or if you accidentally knock your palette over, which is why I have the magnets on the bottom. I do have a video of how I created this specific watercolor palette on this channel, so go ahead and check that out once you're done with this video if you want to see more details on the paints themselves and how I set this all up. I'll be making a video in the future going more in depth on the colors I use for plein air paintings, so if you want to see that, be sure to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss out on that information. The type of brushes I use for my watercolor paints are Princeton Velvet Touch brushes. They've been stuck in the dirt before, they've been rained on, they've been sunbathed, and I can't recall ever losing a single bristle on any of my Princeton Velvet Touch brushes. The next piece of supplies that I bring on plein air painting hikes is this little tiny plastic palette. I go for something that's really lightweight and transportable. I can mix colors, I can dilute colors, and they dry out really quickly in the sun, which is good because that way I can just put the dried out paints back in my backpack. If any of these paints in the palette are not completely dry by the time I'm done painting, I always wipe it clean with a paper towel because we should never dispose of the paint in nature at all. Paper. I personally use Arches watercolor paper, and I prefer cold pressed to hot pressed. Cold pressed has more texture, so when I'm doing landscape paintings and I'm aiming for realism, I like that cold pressed paper captures the texture of the rocks, the texture of the grass, and it makes the whole painting a little bit more realistic and a little bit more earthy. For watercolor paintings, you want to tape down the edges because the water can wrinkle the paper. It can make the edges kind of come up. So if it's curling up, the water will pool at the center of the painting and you won't have as much control. What you're seeing here is the cardboard back of an Arches watercolor paper block that I had. So I took the little piece of paper and I taped down the edges on this bigger piece of rigid cardboard. For my larger paintings, for this 11 by 14 painting, and what I do with anything larger than that is I tape down the edges onto the watercolor block directly. So what you're seeing here is about 20 sheets of paper, and I'm just taping down that top piece of paper to all of the bottom ones. The way I keep all of my painting supplies together is I put it in this old laptop case. The 9x12 rigid piece of cardboard fits so perfectly into the main pocket. Then all of my palettes go into the side pockets and my brushes go into the other side pocket. I find that keeping my materials relatively simple and decently organized is key because it's very easy to lose stuff when you're painting in nature or get overwhelmed by how much you brought. And if there's something I need to add after I'm done with the painting, I go ahead and go back to my campsite or go home and finish the painting there. When it comes to painting outdoors, we might find ourselves painting next to a river or painting next to a lake or any sort of body of water. And I personally recommend you don't use that water at all in the painting process. I pack in my own water. So I use an old water bottle and I bring in my fresh water and I carry out my dirty water. How do we find where to paint? I think about this all the time. To do it to the level of road tripping through national parks, you do have to have a level of foresight to plan and get campgrounds. Sometimes you need permits. If you find a beautiful national park that you want to paint, start planning for what hikes are there. What is the weather there? What time of year do you want to go? So I prefer to travel more on the tail end of summer into fall. The weather is cooler, there's less bugs, there's less people after Labor Day, which is really nice. In the spring, it can be a little bit more difficult because spring is typically a rainy season in Colorado. And when you're painting with watercolors outside, you really don't want any sort of moisture in the air. If you are feeling overwhelmed by all the possibilities, and maybe you're a little overwhelmed by people maybe watching you in these more popular areas, you could start at the local river. You could start on a much smaller hike that's 30 minutes away. There's so many different ways to get outside and paint, and it doesn't always have to be this grand, beautiful place and you make a masterpiece. It can be a very modest area and a very modest painting. The point of plein air is to just get outside, enjoy nature, and do some art. When it comes to plein air, a painting can take anywhere from 30 minutes to 12 to 15 hours. And if we're sitting down for 30 minutes or less, it can be really easy just to sit on the side of the trail and get your painting done. Most of my paintings are about 5 hours to 15 hours a day. And so I want something that's very, very comfortable. What I use is this Grizzly Creek camping chair. This takes all of the pressure off my lower spine and upper spine, and I have sat down for hours. I'm not kidding, 5, 6, 7 hours without realizing how long I've been sitting and not even feeling a thing because this chair is so freaking comfortable. Another pro of this chair is that it's very lightweight and it just clips to my backpack. Other options include benches, sitting directly on a rock that's right next to the trail, and just finding comfortable places where you are out of the way of the people enjoying that nature area, but you are comfortable enough and have enough room to do your painting. Since we're outside, we have to consider the elements. For the weather aspect, it's all about planning and making sure that you will have good weather during your experience. I've painted in really, really, really cold conditions, and I like to have hand warmers and gloves when I do that. I've painted in really, really hot conditions, and I like to find shaded areas when I'm painting in the summertime. Since we are sitting outside for sometimes hours on end, sometimes the entire day, it's so important to protect yourself from the sun. If you can't find a shaded area or the sun moves throughout the day, it's good to have other layers of protection. I wear facial sunscreen throughout the day, and I don't like the feeling of body sunscreen, like those spray sunscreens, because they get really greasy and really nasty pretty quickly, and that can transfer onto my watercolor paper. If there's grease or oil on the paper, then the watercolors won't get absorbed into the paper. Try to avoid any sort of lotions, creams, or sprays, which is why you're seeing me wear long sleeves and long pants in 90-degree Utah weather. They are UPF graded, meaning they protect from all of the rays of the sun. I have watercolor gloves that I use. They are UPF graded as well, so they're really good for preventing my hand oils from spreading onto my canvas, as well as protecting the backs of my hands from the sun. Something else to consider is bugs. And that's another benefit of wearing long sleeves and long pants, is that the bugs that come up to me don't have access to as much skin as they would have. So it prevents a lot of bug bites. Something else to consider is the type of wildlife that is in the area that you're painting. For instance, I painted in Zion, and about 10 feet from me on the trail while I was painting one of the days, there was a tarantula, and I had to be prepared for how I would react to a tarantula walking near me. A more applicable example for people who live in Colorado are elk or moose or even bears, because you're sitting in nature for so long, you're very likely to see different types of animals, and you have to be prepared for that. My number one safety rule when it comes to any animals, and honestly, when it comes to painting in public with people around you, or when you're specifically alone on a trail and you don't know who else is around, is to make sure you can hear what's going on, to make sure you can be aware of anything that's going to happen. So I like to have my ears open, my eyes open, and if I'm painting in bear country, I make sure I have my bear spray, my bear horn next to me. And that's one of the beautiful things about plein air, is that we're not just connecting to the landscape, we're connecting to the wildlife that's there. I've had so many little birdies come up to me, so many squirrels. I've seen different types of butterflies land on my painting, and just some of the most surreal, magical moments have been made while plein air painting, because you're sitting in nature for so long, something is bound to happen. It's just these little moments that come up that really contribute to the beauty of the experience. And last but definitely not least, I want to talk about our biological needs. If you're preparing for a hike, prepare double the food that you would if you're just going on a hike without painting, because you have to think about the time that it takes to get there along the hike. You have to consider the time you're going to sit at the spot, and then you also have to consider the hike down. Sometimes you need a full day's worth of food. Also, make sure to bring fresh water. I've had very personal experience hiking in an area where I didn't have my water filter and I ran out of water at the top when I was done with my painting, but then it was like an 8-mile hike back in the heat. It was not fun, and I recommend always bringing extra. If you think you have enough, bring more is my number one tip for water. And what's going to happen when you drink all this water? You're going to need to pee. I like to paint in an area that's not going to bother someone if I go behind a bush. Those are all the tips and tricks I have. If you want to know more about a specific subject, please let me know. I can make videos specifically about those topics. Thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe if you want to see more plein air content, and if you want to see more watercolor specific content as well.